Hello, it's Jacob again, and we'll be picking up right where we left off with a discussion of what is called Coase bargaining. You're going to learn what that is today. Now, I need to introduce you to two new economists. They're going to join Adam Smith. You'll be meeting quite a few of them over the course of the semester. Now, this man here, he is the English economist Arthur Cecil Pigou, 1877 to 1959. Now, that's the guy that we named the Pigouvian tax and subsidy for. And this man here is the American economist Ronald Coase, 1910 to 2013. And they were both very influential in environmental economics. They were very influential in law and economics. That too is a field, mostly deals with nuisances. But they had very different conclusions about it. However, as we'll find, it's not so much that these two men are enemies as it is that they both had different circumstances in which their approach worked. So, Arthur Cecil Pigou was kind of a reaction to the age of laissez-faire. Throughout the 1800s, the dominant economic orthodoxy revolved around laissez-faire, free markets, the approach of Adam Smith and the many different classical economists who came after him. It was an era when the government was extremely small. It's been said that a British citizen could go his whole life without ever even thinking about the government, as long as he kept his nose clean. And if that was true of Britain, then you can imagine how it was for America. Governments did not concern themselves with much of anything besides a little bit of trade policy and making war on each other. And of course, running the police. And even the police was something that really was developed over the course of the century. But by the 1900s, this was changing. Jevons, that we talked about, was one of the first men to grumble about it. Now, as we saw, his fears were misplaced. He was the first of many people to have a hysteria over resources running out, environmentalist hysteria. But he was a little foresighted in that he saw how economic incentives could potentially lead to the depletion of a resource. And by the early 1900s, you start to get a real concern about the state of nature. You don't really get like a crackdown on smog and effluent and stuff, but you do get panics about land overuse. You get the rise of conservationism as a movement. Personally, I don't consider myself an environmentalist, but I do consider myself a conservationist. In America, you get men like Teddy Roosevelt in this time period, creating our National Park Service. You get things like the Sierra Club. There was a desire to try to leave less of an impact on the earth, and there was also a desire to fix up the cities because they were filthy. There was sewage in the streets. There was horse crap, dead horse carcasses laying all over the roads. And there was also this big shift towards what we call progressivism, a belief that the government should, as part of its democratic nature, actually prioritize actively intervening in people's lives to uplift society and bring it to a better state. And Pigou, he's writing around the same time that this becomes popular in both both Europe and America. In Europe, you get the rise of the so-called social liberals, which in this country would be the Democratic Party. So liberalism, I told you about classical liberalism. Liberalism in this time period splits. In Europe, it's going to become classical liberals and social liberals. In America, the liberals eventually become libertarians, and the more pro-government ones become what we tend to call socialist. In Europe, socialist usually means something much more extreme. Now, Ronald Coase, on the other hand, he was writing much later past World War II when we were having another big backlash. So Pigou lives in an era where people are kind of rediscovering a role for the government. They're sort of questioning if maybe they had gone too far with Adam Smith and the boys and they needed to actually get more hands-on to deal with a very great deal of social dysfunction that the Industrial Revolution had caused. Coase, he's writing in the aftermath of World War II. He's writing in the middle of the Cold War. He's writing in an era where people were no longer afraid of the market getting out of control. They were afraid of totalitarianism. We had seen what fascism did. We knew that the Soviets were still a huge menace to us. There was a much greater skepticism towards the powers of the state. And this affected Coase's view as well, because Coase was also keenly interested in environmental protection. He was keenly interested in legal theory. He understood that our actions have consequences on others and that there needs to be a way to ameliorate that. But unlike Pigou, he had a distrust of centralized planning. And so he was going to come up with a more market-based solution to it. And this ends up being called Coase bargaining. So how does Coase bargaining work? Well, Coase argued, yeah, he had a thing called the Coase theorem. He argued, if people can pay the externality maker, or if the person who wants to cause the externality can pay the third party for the right, it doesn't matter who owns the right. Just if there is a legal right to make the externality and you can trade for it, then it's no longer external because the payment has become part of the opportunity cost. So I'll state that again. The whole point of an externality is that you wind up with an inefficient level of production, either too low or too high, because the third party gets no say. But if the third party can have a say, if they can sell or buy the right to make this externality, then now the externality is not an externality, it's a factor of production, which means that it gets folded into the supply or the demand, whichever side of it we're talking about. There is an expression, we call this internalizing the externality. You make it internal. You make the party feel it by making them pay for it. For Pigou, the way to do that was through a tax or subsidy. Coase said, let people haggle. Let people haggle among themselves. Now, this principle comes up in mediation frequently. Oftentimes, especially in the corporate world, people prefer to strike a bargain instead of going to court. Many lawsuits never reach the courtroom because anything can happen in a courtroom. You might be pretty confident you're going to win or pretty confident you're going to lose, but there is always a risk that it might go the other way, and people don't like risk. People are often willing to part with a little bit of money just to avoid risk. We have a term for that too. I don't teach it in this course. It comes up in what's called information economics, but and it also comes up in insurance as well, but it's called risk aversion, that people don't like uncertain outcomes. So we have this classic example, comes out of the law and economics literature. Suppose a hog farm wants to open near an apartment complex on the edge of town. And hog farms are very smelly. They put out a horrible stench. And it's going to be very offensive to the tenants of that apartment complex. Now, if the landlord had the right to clean air, the hog farm could buy that right from them if they valued it more than the landlord. In order for it to make sense for them to buy it, they would have to value it more. They'd have to be able to offer them a price above what the landlord is, the minimum the landlord would be willing to accept. And if the hog farm had the right, it could sell it to the landlord if the landlord valued it more. But whether the farm opens or not, the externality is eliminated because the external cost has been turned into a factor of production. There is now, simply put, another license, essentially, which the hog farmer has to buy. So that hog farm, they have their supply curve. And that supply curve says, okay, I'm going to produce and I'm going to need this much corn to feed the hogs. I'm going to need this many workers to feed the hogs. I need to build and maintain a building to house them, right? I have all these different expenses. And oh yeah, I also have to have a right to create the stench. I also have to have a right to the nuisance. It doesn't matter. It might matter to your sense of ethics. It might matter as a question of justice. But economically, it doesn't matter whether the landlord or the hog farmer is awarded that right, or the government could even auction it off. The government might award itself the right and then allow them to buy it, to make offers. But either way, that's just going to go into the supply. So the hog farmer, he has to say, can I afford it? Is my business worth buying that license? And the landlord has to ask, are my tenants really going to be that upset that it's worth buying the license? Or could I, if I own the license, would it maybe be better for me to sell it? What's going to damage my revenues? What's going to damage my rent more? Or will it damage my rent more to sell it than I would get from selling it? Regardless of who we award the right to, as long as they're able to voluntarily trade, the right will end up in the hands of the person that has the highest value. Just like at an auction, the good winds up in the hands of the person who has the highest value for it because they're willing to bid the highest. This is a very effective system because it means that you don't have to hire bureaucrats to keep track of it. You don't have to hire economists to do studies to measure the size of the externality. And you don't have to track changes in the externality. Just like how the free market decentralizes your planning and thus allows it to move quicker and with more accuracy, Coase bargaining allows you to decentralize your planning with respect to externalities. Now, one way governments frequently apply this principle is to sell permits, especially with regards to global warming. So under cap and trade, what the government does is it first decides on a socially optimal level of CO2 emissions. Normally, it's understood that we're going to have some level of warming because we have to have some level of industry. and it's not practical for it to all be green. The EPA did recently put out some announcement. They're joining the net zero insanity, but we're not exactly under normal administration at the moment. I'm speaking as of May 2024. Well, under cap and trade, the government decides what level of emissions it believes would be the best. And then it auctions off limited shares of a quota of these greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason why it does this is because the costs and benefits of pollution aren't equal between factories. Some factories may face a higher cost of compliance. So, in one factory, for example, they might be located in the middle of a very large city and they have a lot of customers, but they also have very outdated equipment. And for them to retool their power plant, did I say power? Let's go with a power plant. For them to retool their power plant to be more efficient, to spew less pollution, is going to be a lot more difficult. They're going to have to strip out a lot more machinery. They might have to rebuild sections of the plant. It's going to be very expensive. And if they have any downtime, if they actually have to reduce output for a while, they're going to lose a lot more sales. Now, on the other hand, you might have other plants that are very efficient. They're sleek, they're up to date, they have management that is very good at implementing new technology. And they might be in a growth phase where they're actually prepared to rework their system. And so for them, complying with a lower level of pollution would be easy, and they wouldn't have to give up much for it. Now, in your textbook, it has a specific math problem illustrating this. So let's say that the EPA sets 100 tons of SO2. That's not a typo. That SO2 is another greenhouse gas. They set 100 tons of SO2 per company as the quota. And producer A could save $1,100 if only it was allowed another ton. Whereas producer B would have to increase costs by $200 to cut a ton. Producer A is like that old, outdated plant that's in the middle of town. And producer B is like that new, sleek plant that's good at what it does. And so, if producer B was allowed to sell its permits to producer A, there would be $900 in savings to society, but there'd be the same amount of pollution. Now, from an engineering perspective, this is a more inefficient outcome because you get less electricity for the same amount of pollution. But economically, that can still make sense because the value of electricity depends on where you're at. The level of production depends on where you're at. Oftentimes, a firm might have some advantage with other resources that makes it worth operating, but they're behind in just one way. And what this allows for is it allows for competitive businesses to stay alive, even if they have just this one issue that they can't really cope with. But the total pollution, it's the same regardless. Whether the government mandates that you're only allowed to have 100 and that's it, or if it allows them to trade the rights with each other. Now, one thing I do want to note here is that this is only good if everybody's in on it. something to keep in mind is producers firstly have a choice of where to locate. We all know over the past several decades, much of America's industry outsourced itself to the third world, especially to China. Do you think they have good environmental regulations in China? Do you think they give a shit how much CO2 they put into the atmosphere? No. And so if you make your environmental regulations too difficult to comply with, see, a company that locates in America, it locates where it does because it it's more profitable here, right? Even if it has to pay higher wages to American citizens, even if it has to comply with stricter regulations, there's other advantages that it has to being in the US that makes it worth it. If you make the regulations too onerous though, and that gamble and that trade-off changes, now it's better to locate overseas. Well, they have no reason to keep themselves at the same level of cleanliness anymore. They're going to pollute more. And that's one way you can shoot yourself in the foot with environmental policy. It's ugly. It's unfortunate that we live in a world where that's an option. But this cap and trade, that's one big problem you run into. Pigouvian taxes on CO2 emissions. Same thing. If people can just flee across the ocean and then spew all the smog they want, tightening up environmental regulations here might actually worsen total pollution. Thankfully, there is a way you can deal with this, and it's called put a tariff on it. You might not be able to tax products that are made in China that are sold in China, but if it's made in China and imported to the US, you can tax it when it comes into the port. Oddly enough, the American political establishment didn't seem to care about that. They were very, very opposed to Trump's trade war against the Chinese. Well, this system, this is what we use in the United States. At the Kyoto Protocol, where the whole world got together to try to hammer out our plan for how we were going to deal with global warming. The United States and Japan wanted to implement a cap and trade scheme globally, so all of the different nations would all, share these tradable permits with each other. Europe wasn't on board. They didn't want to be a part of it. Much more socialist society than ours. Now, tradable allowances and Coase bargaining can even clean up the environment by itself. So, if anybody is allowed to buy the rights, people who want lower pollution can buy the rights themselves just to deny them to somebody else. And this happens. Under cap and trade, there are environmentalist charities that buy up CO2 permits to not use them. They feel that the government isn't doing enough. They disagree with the government, believes that it should be stricter. And they put their money where their mouth is. They gather a fund, buy up permits, and then sit on them. And this has been done with other things too, like habitat preservation. So, practical example for you. In the Pacific Northwest, they have this problem with rivers. Now, in the East, water rights have never been that big of a problem in the Eastern US. They are a bit of a problem with Georgia and Tennessee's dispute over the Tennessee River. Atlanta is a very, very thirsty city. and so they want to get more access to that. But for the most part, the eastern U.S. is so lush that it's not a particularly big concern. But in the West, it's a very big concern. You got the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains. You have the vast Great Plains and the high kind of prairie of Texas. And for states that are on the wrong side of it, they're left quite parched. And they're mostly dependent on a mixture of groundwater and whatever few piddly little rivers that they've got. And in that environment, water was so precious that people were willing to shoot each other over it. And so the government introduced something called riparian water doctrine. If you have a stretch of river on your land, you control the river. It's your river. And essentially, all of that water is your property until it flows out of your river. If you don't use it, it's not yours anymore. Now, up in the Pacific Northwest, you've got a conflict between different desires. Farmers would like to divert the rivers to irrigate more cropland. Municipal governments would like to divert the river to municipal water systems. Electric companies would like to build more hydropower dams. And then you got the fish huggers. See, a tree hugger is scary enough, but a fish hugger, that's something else. They got salmon hatcheries along these rivers. And frankly, I don't understand it. Some of you are going to be environmental majors, so you might be able to explain it to me. I don't know why people care about salmon so much, but people want to preserve them. And these other competing goals endanger the salmon hatcheries. So, how do we decide who gets to use the water? Who gets to use the water? Well, in a Pigouvian world, you would have some crazy complicated set of like taxes and subsidies and all kinds of things to measure how the flow of water out of one person's property affects everyone downstream. And it would quickly get so complicated that it would overwhelm the ability of the government to measure it. You wouldn't even really be able to use a market to do that. You would have to end up implementing some kind of political solution. But riparian water doctrine allows for people to trade. If the flow of water through your property is itself a type of property, then someone could offer to sign a contract with you. You promise to divert them a certain amount. And then people are able to bid on this in a competitive market. And what you find is that when you have people compete with each other in this way, when they're forced to put their money where their mouth is, they tend to be a lot more reasonable in what they demand. Political environmental policy, political conservationism often ends up being this like fight to the death where one side wins all and the other sides lose all. Either your faction is big enough to carry the day or it's not. And you get a very extreme outcome. And political conservation is also very politically unstable for the same reason. Your side might be able to win a certain concession, but it can always be overturned by the democratic process at a later date. If public opinion is fickle, right? And it can always blow against you. We saw something quite a bit like that with the Keystone Pipeline that Joe Biden shut down. They had been working on that thing for years. Obama had shut it down. Trump started it back up. And then Biden takes office. First day, he shuts it down. It was environmentalist pressure. There really was nothing wrong with the pipeline, but they anti-oil agenda, right? All the workers have to go home. You don't get cheap oil from Canada now. But you see how by letting that be a government decision, it could be overturned overnight. Well, for those of you that are of a more environmentalist bent, this can hurt you as well. When you have preservation that depends on the government, if a government that is hostile to environmental preservation takes over, they're going to axe your programs. They're going to sell off your public lands. They're going to allow the mining to start up again. Biden had he also canceled a lot of oil drilling contracts. Well, think about this, my environmentalists in the room. What happens the next time a Republican president or a fossil fuel friendly Democrat takes office? They're going to start up those contracts. This is one of the ironies of leaving it up to the government. The government is not necessarily a stable decision maker because it has a tendency to flip-flop so much as power is passed between the two political parties. On the other hand, business relationships can often be much more stable. They may not, but they can be. And if you directly own the property yourself, and if it's not left up to some kind of regulatory regime, then they can't force you to sell. What you end up getting in the Pacific Northwest is a division of water. Some of it's diverted to the farm, some of it's put into hydroelectric plants, which create reservoirs. Some of it's kept for salmon hatcheries. Some of it's kept for the municipal governments. Everyone has to reach into their own pocket to do what they want to do. And it means that they take it a lot more seriously and they don't ask for the whole enchilada. Incidentally, there was a news article last semester when I was teaching this. The state of California decided to tear down a bunch of dams that the fish huggers claimed that they were screwing with the salmon's hatching, and when they tore the dams down, it actually caused this like big suction that swept up a bunch of fish and killed them. So well done. Well done. Well done, geniuses. California strikes again. When the government sets blunt quotas and regulations for externalities, it imposes a one-size-fits-all solution that ignores context. If you directly meddle in prices and quantities, then you can cause shortages and surpluses, and you run into the same economic calculation problem that you would with any other kind of central planning. And if you mandate the same rules for everyone, that can kill productive enterprises. Because sometimes you have firms that are genuinely useful. Under a regulatory regime, you could make exceptions. They do. You appeal to them. You say, please, Mr. Uncle Sam, don't make me shut my firm down. Don't make me apply that new filter to my smokestacks. I can't afford it. I provide a public service, a very large one. I provide a lot of jobs. I provide a lot of output. You don't want to kill my business. But you can imagine how you go to Uncle Sam with your plea. It might be a while before you hear back. Might not get the answer you want. Coast bargaining is snappy. It goes fast. And it allows for a level of nuance that a bureaucratic approach can never achieve. It takes advantage of decentralized planning. It takes advantage of that collective brain to take into account individual, localized needs. And in that sense, it matches up very well with the spirit of American federalism. There are ways Coase's theorem can break down, though. See, Coase requires clear and enforceable property rights and low transaction costs. Now, what do I mean by clear and enforceable property rights? You have to be able to specify what exactly the right is. You have to be able to define it legally in a way that, like, you could bring it into a courtroom if someone were to violate the contract. And it has to actually be actionable. And this isn't going to work with everything. For example, I gave you the problem of outsourcing to avoid CO2 pollution. The US government might decide it's only going to produce a certain amount of CO2, but it has no ability to enforce that on other governments. And we don't care how much the US makes, we care about the total amount in the air. What's meant by transaction costs? Well, transaction costs are the costs of negotiating. Mostly this means time. If the negotiation is preventing you from operating your business, that includes the profits you lose. And it can also include things like lawyers' fees. And transaction costs have this tendency to grow exponentially as you add more parties to negotiate with. So, for example, with the hog farm scenario, that was a very practical and realistic scenario. It was an actual legal case. Very practical scenario for a Coase bargain because there was one landlord who was capable of negotiating on behalf of his tenants with the hog farm. So even if the landlord doesn't live there, he still cares about it because it affects his potential rent. It affects the demand for his service. But suppose there had been 50 separate families instead. Suppose instead of an apartment complex, it was a private residential neighborhood. Well, then the hog farm, if the local families collectively owned the right to clean air, the hog farm would have to negotiate with 50 separate families. They can't make a nuisance for just one person. There's no way that they can like pump the air into one house but not another. Either they buy out the right from everybody or they buy it from nobody. And likewise, if the hog farm owned the right and families in the area wanted to buy them out, they too would run into a coordination problem. See, individually, they probably none of them suffer enough from the hog farm that it's worth paying for the hog farm to shut down, even if collectively they all suffer enough for it to be worth shutting it down. And so you'd run into a couple of problems. The first is you'd have to deal with free riders. People who they know that their decision to individually contribute to a fund isn't going to affect the size of the fund all that much. And so they don't want to contribute. It's hard to collect the money. And there would also be the organizational difficulty of getting that many people together in the first place. This is a principle of life in general. The more people you add to some kind of negotiation or planning process, the harder it's going to be to strike a deal. And because of this, Coase is going to be best suited to specific local problems. Situations where a local government or a local business or a local homeowners association or a local chamber of commerce can get together using some kind of pre-existing structure, some corporate identity, and haggle with the offending party. Chambers of commerce exist to do exactly that. They're voluntary organizations, but it's essentially a private club of local businesses that get together to find ways to promote each other's businesses. They look for positive externalities to reward. But if you don't have that condition, when you're looking at very big problems that affect many people, the transaction costs are going to be so high that having a practical Coase bargain becomes impossible. And global warming would be such an example of an international prisoner's dilemma. Collectively, it might be the case that each nation would be better off if everyone were to reduce their emissions, if everyone else were to reduce their emissions. But understanding that your one country doesn't have that big of an impact on it, you always want to cheat. You have 195 sovereign states to negotiate with and little ability to enforce it. Again, it's got to be enforceable. So Coase bargains are going to be awesome for local problems, but they're going to be completely worthless for very big, problems. And that's where we have to go back to Pigou with his Pigouvian taxes and Pigouvian subsidies, or where you have to use a hybrid system like what the government does with cap and trade. Now, you may also sometimes hear about so-called network externalities or network effects, when the value of a good depends on the number of other people using it. Now, these are not, they are not going to be considered inefficient. They're not considered market failures because the effect of the externality does wind up getting priced into it. It's like the pecuniary externality. It's not really external in the first place. It's an abuse of the word. Well, these two come in positive and negative forms. So if you have a good that becomes more useful the more other people use it, that would be a positive network externality. And some examples of that would include things like standardization of measures, standardization of things like wall sockets, screws, pieces, right? Well, we'll standardize pieces so that when you buy something, it's going to fit. You find this comes up a lot in telecommunications of different types. The first man to own a phone must have been a pretty lonely guy, right? The benefits of owning a phone would have been very, very low to him. Someone else gets a phone. Well, now that's something to talk about. You could call that person up. Probably get tired talking to them all the time. Well, then say you have 10 people that have phones, 100 people, 1,000 people. The more people join, the more people you have that you can talk to. And this applies to other technologies. Social media wasn't always as big as it is now. It remained a very niche thing for a long time. Basically started on college campuses. But nobody wants to be on a social media site that's a ghost town. Nobody wants to be on one that's a wasteland. Nobody wants to play a multiplayer game that has no user base. The value of the good increases as more people join, but then those people joining increases the value even more, thus drawing in more and more and more. And you get these snowball effects where a particular product will become ubiquitous very quickly, or a certain service will have a tendency to grow out of control. In the case of negative network externalities, the reverse is true. And your negative network externalities, often these are things like roads, certain kinds of services like golf courses and amusement parks, clubs. In general, if it's something whose value depends on it being exclusive or whose value depends to some extent on how congested it is, like it gets crowded and that it's not fun going there when it's crowded, that would be a negative network externality. But these aren't failures because, again, if having more people on the site means the benefits are higher, then the individual demand is also going to be higher. So the price reflects uh, the price does reflect the impact that each consumer has on the others. For now, Uh, these don't have much importance to what we're talking about later, but you will hear this concept again in excludability and rivalry when I talk about public goods. You can have situations where it makes more sense for the government to provide something, um, due to the presence of certain network externalities. And they also play a big role in competition because they play a big role in determining the optimal size of a firm. If a brand has its own externalities, then if it has very strong positive network externalities, that's going to result in that brand outcompeting the others and potentially forming a monopoly. You tend to see this with, in particular, I see this with social media, where you really have the two main big giants. And you also see it with multiplayer games where, yeah, that's fair to say. Um, Within a certain niche, within a certain brand, sorry, I should have said genre, within a certain genre, you'll often only have one big title or maybe two competitors that kind of differentiate themselves. But for now, I just want you to keep that concept in the back of your mind because I will make references to network externalities later, but they're not considered a failure in and of themselves. So, in conclusion, externalities are a type of market failure where the consumption or production of a good has effects on uninvolved third parties. A network externality is an external cost. It inflicts deadweight loss by resulting in too much quantity being produced, and you can alleviate it by implementing a Pigouvian tax. If people's actions affect others, you need to tax them to make them feel the consequences of their actions. With positive externalities, those are external benefits. And so they also have a deadweight loss because you'll wind up with too little quantity. And you need to reward people with a Pigouvian subsidy. But when property rights are clear and transaction costs are low, which usually means when there are few people involved. We don't need Pigouvian taxes and subsidies because Coase bargaining, tradable property rights, rights to create externalities, can be used as a much more efficient, decentralized system. You fix the market by taking that which was external and turning it into a good. You turn it into property that can be, you turn the property right into property that can be bought and sold. And in so doing, you effectively create a market in economic planning. And this can be very good as an alternative to direct regulation. So, in the next topic, we'll be looking at excludability and rivalry and how it can be used to classify goods into different types. And we'll see how this can result in market failures like the tragedy of the commons, as well as how it lays out our theory for what types of goods should be publicly provided. When do you have situations where a private market will never work and you need to have it be public? And I'll see you then.